Hello. So we're reading Denial of Death or reviewing Denial of Death, and this is chapters 7, 8, and 9. I will say, now that I'm on chapter 9, a lot of these chapters kind of semi-relate to one another, but then he goes on these tangents where a lot of the stuff isn't relevant to the thesis of the book or to the main point of the chapter. And chapter 7 is a good example of this. So in chapter 7, it's called like the Nexus of Unfreedom. And the primary idea inside chapter 7 is the concept of transference and how it relates back to this notion of heroism. So if you remember for Becker, there's an urge to be a hero because we have a fear of death. And as a result of this urge to be a hero, we do this thing called transference. In psychoanalysis, transference is the idea that you treat some other figure like your parent, or you kind of idolize them or romanticize them. You kind of make them unhuman in some sense. And rather than this being related to some kind of like childhood trauma or something like this, he relates it back to the urge to be a hero, our fear of death. And he goes with the examples of like, we'll do transference onto famous historical figures. We'll romanticize them to the point where like they're beyond human. And as a result of that, we can kind of engage in their heroics, or we get a sense of their heroics, but also we get guided by it. Another one might be a teacher. You can do some transference with a teacher. Any figure that you kind of treat as beyond human. So he kind of replaces the foundation of what motivates transference in this chapter. And he does talk about some of the consequences of doing that, how like if you've developed an object of transference, then that object can shape your morality, so on and so forth. That stuff doesn't matter. The general point of this chapter is that one of the consequences of this heroism psychology, this urge to be a hero, is that we engage in transference, and the transference is related back to heroism. Now, in chapter 8, he kind of takes this idea of transference a little bit further with some of the ideas from Otto Rank, and talks about how culture is a symbolic denial of our creaturely nature. And as a result, it's kind of like a heroic thing. And he talks about, for example, Christianity. In Christianity, when you get indoctrinated or educated in it, what they tell you is that by being a good person or following some principles or being heroic, you'll be rewarded with heaven. He says as a result of this as well that when you deny Christianity, which he argues modern man to some extent has, you then lose that heroic culture. And so he argues that Christianity is a type of heroic culture, and people have since lost that heroic culture. And he says there are two general approaches when you do this. One is romanticization. So one way to cope with the loss of a heroic culture is to engage in romanticization, which can let you create another one. And romanticization can be things like romanticizing a loved one, that person, all your actions in life are going to be to acquire the affection of that person who you've romanticized, right? Who you've transferenced onto or transferred onto. Or another one could be, I don't know, maybe you're pursuing glory, and so you've romanticized the perceptions of others about you. And maybe you could say it's a kind of narcissism. That's another type of romanticization. Things like these kind of romanticizations of things are a way of coping with this. Now, he argues there is a subset of coping with the loss of a heroic culture, and he says that this is the creative solution. So the romantic solution is to obviously just idealize things, make things beyond human. And the other one is the creative solution. And the creative solution is a subset of the idealization. The difference being is that it's not within the norm. It is a unique way of going about it. He argues that creatives tend to do this. They create their own sets of meaning out of their neurosis or their fear towards death. And the only difference between the idealized person, or like the idealization approach, and the creative approach is that one is just not common. That's it. Now, chapter 9 takes both chapter 7 and chapter 8 and adds to both of the ideas in those chapters, but again, it goes a bit into things that he doesn't need to go into. The book really could have been a lot shorter. And the ideas in chapter 9 it's twofold. So he talks about the types of neurotics in chapter 9 and how to classify them. He says, on the one hand, there are people who develop objects of transference or develop transference for objects, but they do it in a way that's too narrow. So in the case of someone who develops a transference for a loved one, and the loved one, like just one person, becomes the entire fixation of their life. It's like overly romanticized. They become, as he says, a reflex of the object of love. And so it's too narrow. And as a result, you could say it's too unstable. If something happens to that loved person, then you can become completely knocked, like your foundation can be wiped out from underneath you. And so he calls it like the too narrowly focused neurotic, someone who creates only like a singular object of transference. And then there's the one who is too wide or too open, and as a result can't really engage in any kind of commitment towards anything because they have too many objects that are pulling them into too many different directions. And so they're kind of like the anxious type that worry about everything. They haven't picked enough objects when it comes to creating objects of transference for your urge to be heroic. Now, as a result of this kind of thinking, he actually has a system in place that he now communicates to us that I think is probably the most interesting thing he's said in the entire book so far. And it's this kind of like levels of analysis for, he says mental health, but I would say just human psychology in general. And it's, so on the one hand, you can look at what people fixate on. He says their fixations or their objects of transference. We can look at that. Are they only focused on one thing? Do they have like this idealization of a loved partner? Or do they have an idealization of a god? How many things do they idealize? So he says we can analyze their fixations. The next thing is we can look at the content of their illusions. So if you remember for Becker that since we engage in heroics as a way of coping with our fear of death, we kind of over time nullify ourselves to that fact. We kind of hide from that fact. And in earlier chapters, he says that, like, for example, children can experience the rawness of nature itself, but humans kind of add limitations onto their perceptions of reality because he argues we're born with our instincts. And so we have a hard time acting in this world because we are born with our instincts. And so we have to create these kind of obfuscations on our perceptions, these kind of limitations to behave properly, right? So like, how do we find meaning in life? Well, I don't know. Well, I'll just call myself a lawyer and I'll do lawyer things, okay? He thinks these are lies. And so we can look at people's different types of lies or illusions, as he puts them, and see if they match their fixations, whether they don't match their fixations, how robust of an illusion it is, things like that. And then the last thing he talks about, which is really interesting, is going over the different systems of illusions that have been passed on through time. So he talks about Christianity being one of them. The Enlightenment can be like another one. Buddhism can be one. These are different systems that have different ways of dealing with the fact that we're going to die. And you can look at the impacts of those systems on individuals throughout time. He argues, for example, that when people have gone from Christianity, they then went to therapists. It's kind of a crazy claim, but people went from Christianity and going from like the church and having God be their object of transference to then having a therapist be their object of transference and having the therapist tell them what to do in life, as opposed to God. That's an example of going from a theistic system to a secular system of these kind of systems of illusions. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of way of analyzing human psychology. I don't think it's the most robust or like scientifically founded or like empirically founded, but it is interesting. So those are chapters 7, 8, and 9. I'll do the last two next week. It's chapters 10 and 12. And with that being said, let me know what you think, and bye-bye for now.